14 medieval European medical treatments that were worse than death. They locked the patient inside a sealed wooden box, lit a fire underneath, and then told the sick person to take a deep breath. This wasn't torture. It was legitimate medical treatment, prescribed by a doctor, sold by a pharmacy, and paid for by the patient. And this wasn't even the worst of it. In medieval Europe, there were treatments that made the sick beg for death rather than continue their recovery. Here are the 15 most bizarre and insane treatments administered by medieval doctors. If you watch until the end, you'll witness Fact 15, a phenomenon that modern psychologists still cannot entirely explain. Fact 1. Trepanation. In 1346, in northern France, a blacksmith fell from a roof onto the stone pavement. He didn't die immediately, but after the impact, his body began to convulse, his eyes lost focus, and his consciousness drifted in and out. Today, medicine calls this a subdural hematoma. To medieval healers, the thing trapped inside was evil pressure that needed to be released, and the way to release it was to drill straight into the patient's skull. This was no occult ritual. In many European medical centers of the era, trepanation was a genuine procedure applied to wounded soldiers, artisans involved in accidents, or people suffering from prolonged, unexplained headaches. The blacksmith was pinned down on a wooden plank. The closest thing to anesthesia was wine mixed with raw opium, just enough to slow the mind slightly. Two assistants locked his shoulders and head to prevent his body from thrashing midway. Then, the healer placed the drill against the skull. You didn't just feel the pain. You heard it. The sound of metal grinding against bone echoed directly inside the head dry, screeching, heavy, like rocks being scraped right behind the eardrums. Every rotation pressed a little deeper, slowly, patiently. And here is the part no one expects sometimes. This method actually worked. Archaeologists have found ancient skulls with drill holes where the bone had healed over proof that more than a few patients survived the procedure. In some severe cases of traumatic brain injury, relieving the pressure inadvertently prolonged their lives, but the metal tools, reused time and again, were almost never properly cleaned. The damp, moldy air, the cloth rags, and the healer's bare hands became the direct pathway for infection to enter the brain. The blacksmith woke up. Perhaps his head felt lighter for the first few days. Then the fever arrived. Many patients ultimately died not from the initial fall, but from the very surgery designed to save them. Trepanation left a visible wound. The next method didn't, and that is why it was even more dangerous. Fact 2. Bloodletting, draining the life force under the blade. In medieval Europe, when someone suffered from high fever, prolonged headaches, or severe exhaustion, the diagnosis was almost universally singular: the body contained too much bad blood. And the cure was just as simple: drain it out. This belief stemmed from the four humors theory of Hippocrates and Galen, which stated that the body was governed by blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When any of these fell out of balance, disease occurred, and blood was considered the easiest to become excessive. The patient was seated on a wooden chair, their arm tied tightly to make the veins bulge beneath the skin. The healer held a small blade called a lancet and sliced directly into the blood vessel. The dark blood flowed into a bowl placed below. The problem was, many didn't know when to stop. They kept draining until the patient turned ashen. Their lips lost color, and their body nearly collapsed. Ironically, that exact state was often viewed as a sign of successful treatment. And in many European towns, The person performing this procedure wasn't even a doctor, it was the barber. The barber surgeon was a legitimate profession of the era. In the morning, they cut hair. In the afternoon, they sliced open veins, using the exact same tool set, with the exact same hands. The red and white striped barber pole seen today is a relic of that era. Red symbolizes blood. White represents the bandages wrapped around the patient's arm. Even George Washington died after being drained of nearly 40% of his blood volume in a single day to treat a throat infection. And the most terrifying part is that bloodletting didn't just exist in the Middle Ages. It continued to be considered legitimate medicine for centuries afterward. Fact 3. Cauterizing wounds with red-hot iron. In a world without antibiotics, a deep, improperly treated wound could kill a person slower, but with far more certainty than the wound itself. Infection seeps into the bloodstream. High fevers persist, and there was no way to stop it from the inside. Therefore, many European healers opted for a method as simple as it was brutal if you can't kill the bacteria. Burn the entire area away. This technique was called cauterization, pressing a red-hot iron directly onto the flesh to stop bleeding, destroy damaged tissue, and seal the wound with heat. It was widely applied to battlefield injuries, massive lacerations, and inflamed external tumors. Albucasis, the most famous Arab surgeon of the 10th century, described over 50 different ways to use hot iron in his medical texts, and European physicians inherited them almost completely intact. The patient was pinned down on a wooden board. There was no true anesthesia, only alcohol and sometimes a bit of herbal extract, just enough to slightly dull perception. In the corner of the room, an iron rod sat in a charcoal furnace until the metal tip glowed a bright orange. The radiating heat could be felt before it even touched the body. And the moment the metal was pressed into the damaged skin, a dry, sharp hiss echoed through the room, a sound many survivors described as something they could never forget. Even decades later, the stench of burning flesh spread almost instantaneously. Skin and tissue were incinerated on the spot. Many patients had to bite down on a rag to avoid injuring themselves when the agony hit. After the procedure, the skin shriveled into a hard, black, charcoal-like scar, the permanent mark of having been cured. But here is the unpredictable part: extreme heat actually has the ability to annihilate bacteria and coagulate tissue to stop bleeding almost immediately. The principle wasn't wrong. Electrocautery scalpels in modern operating rooms function on the exact same mechanism. The only difference is that today, the temperature is controlled down to the degree, and the patient is placed under general anesthesia before anything touches their body. Medieval healers were right about the fire. What they lacked was everything else. The problem lay inside the body, the injuries that red-hot iron couldn't reach. And when confronting internal illness, medieval medicine had another solution that, just by hearing it described, makes many people want to refuse treatment entirely. Fact 4. Animal feces as medicine. Step into a 14th century European pharmacy. On the wooden shelves sit tightly sealed clay jars, sporting Latin labels as if they contained precious pharmaceuticals. One of them bears the name album graecum. It sounds like an ancient mineral. In reality, it was the white, calcified crust scraped from dog feces dried under the sun. In the medicine of the era, substances with a pungent odor and hot properties were believed to force the body to react violently and expel the disease. The writings of Pliny the Elder once described dog feces to cure a sore throat, pigeon feces to reduce inflammation, each type used for a different ailment. Thus, if someone had a chronic cough or swollen, red tonsils, They might be fed a spoonful of album graecum mixed with honey. It wasn't just dogs. Rat droppings were used for intestinal diseases. Cow dung was applied to aching joints. Sheep feces were mixed with water for those suffering from prolonged fevers. In many pharmacies of the time, animal feces were categorized and sold almost exactly like herbs. The bizarre thing is that centuries later, modern science discovered that the gut microbiome genuinely has a massive impact on human health. Medieval healers did not understand bacteria or the immune system, but they had accidentally stumbled upon a very real biological pathway using methods that modern people find utterly unbelievable. Fact 5. Eye surgery with a needle. In medieval Europe, for patients slowly losing their vision to cataracts, there was only one option, known as couching. No lasers, no modern anesthetics. Just a long metal needle and a single command given to the patient: do not blink. This technique survived for thousands of years, from ancient medicine all the way to medieval European towns. And almost the entire procedure revolved around a single action: thrusting the needle into the patient's eye while they were completely awake. The patient sat on a wooden chair, their head clamped tightly from behind. Then, the tip of the needle began its approach. Many survivors later said the most terrifying part wasn't the pain, but the fact that they had to watch the entire process unfold. The needle's tip growing larger and larger right before their eyes. Slowly, until it pierced through the edge of the sclera. The healer did not extract the cloudy lens. They used the needle to push the lens off its visual axis so light could enter the eye once again. If successful, the patient could perceive light almost immediately, although the resulting vision was usually permanently blurred and distorted. If the healer's hand slipped, the patient could lose their sight entirely. And what's remarkable is that couching hasn't entirely disappeared. International medical organizations still record this procedure, taking place in some regions lacking access to modern health care, where local healers use homemade tools to perform it, meaning that somewhere in this 21st century, there is still someone sitting motionless in a chair, fully awake, watching a needle plunge straight into their eye. At least couching gave patients a chance to see the light again. The next method was different. Even the person prescribing it didn't know the line between the curing dose and the dose that started to kill. Fact 6. Mercury for syphilis. Suffocating in silver vapor. In the late 15th century, Europe faced a terrifying disease that was completely different from the Black Death. The plague killed in a matter of days, fast, definitive, and brief. Syphilis was the exact opposite. It didn't steal a patient's life immediately. It destroyed them bit by bit, in a way many described as far more horrific than a swift death. Ulcers appeared on the skin and spread over time. Vision deteriorated. Bones began to be eaten away from the inside. The face gradually deformed, the nasal cartilage collapsed. Skin ulcerated in patches, and a late-stage patient's face became almost unrecognizable. And in an era before antibiotics, the medical community was virtually powerless against a disease systematically and unstoppably eroding the body. Then they found something that seemed to generate a reaction violent enough to combat it: mercury. In 1496, just 1 year after the disease violently erupted in Naples, Italian physician Giorgio Somariva first recorded the use of mercury as an official treatment. From then on, this liquid silver metal rapidly became the only thing European medicine trusted for the next 300 years. Initially, mercury was mixed into ointments to be smeared over ulcers, or diluted for patients to drink directly. But the most haunting method was toxic metal vapor therapy. The patient was locked inside a sealed wooden box. leaving only a small hole for their head to stick out. Beneath them sat a charcoal brazier heating liquid mercury. As the temperature rose, metallic vapor pooled inside the cramped box, and the patient had to sit still inside it for hours, sometimes for multiple sessions over several weeks. The intense heat caused sweat to pour out, while toxic gas entered through their lungs and skin simultaneously. After a few sessions, many patients began to drool uncontrollably. Their mouths swelled and inflamed, and their limbs trembled uncontrollably. The healers of the time viewed this as a positive sign proof that the body was expelling the toxic disease. Mercury actually possessed the ability to inhibit the syphilis bacteria, Treponema pallidum, to a certain degree, which is why this method sometimes produced genuine short-term improvements and continued to be trusted for centuries. But the dose sufficient to slow the disease was also enough to obliterate the nervous system, cause teeth to fall out, and inflict permanent kidney and liver damage for the rest of their lives. Many people didn't fall to syphilis. First, they collapsed from the very thing used to cure it. Europeans of that era passed around a bitter saying that is still quoted in medical history texts today: "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." One moment of pleasure exchanged for years of living with metal toxicity inside the body. If they even lived that long. Mercury at least had some scientific basis, even if completely misunderstood and misapplied. The next method on this list didn't even have that. And the pain it inflicted didn't come from fire or toxic gas, but from cold metal thrust into a place no one wants to think about. Fact 7. Metal urinary catheters, cold metal in agony. When the urinary tract becomes completely blocked, the body enters a highly critical state. The bladder is bloated and rigid, but the pressure cannot be released. If prolonged too much, it can rupture, leading to a fatal infection. Medieval medicine had almost exactly one solution, forcing a metal tube straight into the body to create an artificial escape route for the urine. The tool was usually made of silver or copper, hard, cold, and possessing virtually no elasticity, no modern anesthetics, no true sterilization. The healer simply wiped it down with alcohol or vinegar and began the procedure while the patient was pinned down. With such tools, a slight misalignment in the angle or the application of too much force could easily tear the soft internal tissues. And that happened frequently. Many patients reacted violently right on the treatment table. Worse, the tool carried bacteria straight into the bladder, turning a blockage into a systemic infection in a matter of days. What is remarkable is that even in that era, there were people warning about the extreme dangers of this procedure. Albucasis, the 10th century Arab surgeon, emphasized that this should only be the absolute last resort and must be executed with extreme caution. But over time, people remembered how to use the tool more than why they should fear it. And at least with a metal catheter, the patient knew what they were enduring. The next method was different people drank down things that even the person prescribing them didn't truly know what was inside. Fact 8. Mummy powder. From around the 12th century. A dark brown, exorbitantly expensive powder named mumia appeared on the shelves of many European pharmacies. People mixed it with wine or water to cure headaches, internal bleeding, and various other internal pains. But that powder did not come from herbs. It was ground from Egyptian mummies. The aristocracy of the time believed that a body capable of surviving thousands of years under the desert sands must possess something powerful enough to ward off disease. Bones were crushed into powder. Dried skin was scraped off. Almost every remnant inside a tomb could be transformed into medicine. Then demand began to exceed the supply of real mummies. When the tombs ran out of inventory, merchants turned to a much cheaper source: the corpses of executed prisoners, the homeless, the unclaimed dead. The bodies were embalmed with bitumen, dried out, and then ground into powder to be sold under the guise of authentic mumia. The most terrifying detail lies in the reaction of the medical community at the time. In 1585, the French surgeon Ambroise Paré publicly complained about the quality of this medicine. But what bothered him wasn't the fact that humans were drinking powder ground from corpses. He was only worried that fake medicine made from low-grade bodies would be less effective. Mumia at least gave people the illusion they were taking medicine. The next method offered no illusions whatsoever, only the sensation of the body being slowly drained in silence. Fact 9. Blood-sucking leeches. Silent mouths on the flesh. After centuries of bloodletting with blades, European medicine pivoted to a method considered gentler. They used leeches. When a patient had a high fever or severe exhaustion, the healer would place slick, black leeches on their arms, neck, or legs to draw out the bad blood. The patient lay perfectly still, watching the creatures slowly swell, turning dark red corresponding to the amount of blood extracted. A leech's saliva contains a natural anticoagulant, causing the blood to continue flowing even after they detach from the skin. It was exactly this property that allowed the method to survive for hundreds of years. Even in 2004, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved medical leeches for certain modern surgical procedures. But in medieval Europe, this practice was often pushed too far. Many patients had far too many leeches attached at once, losing more blood than their bodies could withstand. Some did not die from their original illness. Their bodies simply lacked the strength to recover after the treatment. At least leeches allowed the patient to lie still in silence. The next method was different. You had to be completely awake when it began. Fact 10. Amputation without anesthesia. What patients could never forget. When necrosis began spreading through an arm or leg, medieval medicine had essentially one remaining option: amputate the limb before the infection spread any further. And everything took place while the patient was entirely awake. The sick person was pinned down onto a wooden table, while the healer took a metal saw and placed it directly against the exposed bone beneath the flesh. Then, the room echoed with a sound that many survivors could never forget for the rest of their lives. The sound of metal grinding through bone, no standard anesthesia, no way to separate the patient from the agony and the pressure transmitting straight through their entire body. Some people passed out mid-surgery. Others never woke up after a prolonged state of shock. And even when the amputation was complete, the greatest danger still lay ahead: infection from an open wound in a completely non-sterile environment. To mitigate the patient's violent reactions on the operating table, healers began experimenting with concoctions capable of putting a person into a stupor before the surgery began. But the harder they tried to push the body toward a state of sensory deprivation, the closer they edged to another, equally dangerous boundary. The next method was also built on a very clear belief, and that belief ended up making death arrive even faster than the disease. Fact 11. Ointments from toxic herbs. In many medieval surgeries, before the blade ever touched the body, the patient was often forced to drink a violently bitter herbal concoction mixed with wine. Inside that liquid were highly toxic plants, like hemlock and henbane. These were the rare few things the medicine of the era believed were potent enough to paralyze the sensation of pain. Healers ground the leaves, roots, and seeds into a thick paste to apply to the skin, or brewed it for the patient to drink before operating. But the problem was, They had virtually no way to accurately control the toxicity of each dose. The patient lay completely still, pupils dilated, breathing slowed, and in many cases, no one was certain if the person was in a deep sleep or if their body had begun to shut down. The distance between a pain-relieving dose and a lethal dose was sometimes a matter of a few drops of extract. The bizarre thing is that a fragment of this method still survives in modern medicine. The active compound hyoscine, found in henbane, is still refined today for use in certain motion sickness medications and preoperative anesthetics. Medieval healers had found the right type of plant. What they lacked was the ability to control a safe dosage. And in the next truth, the thing placed on the patient's body wasn't a blade, wasn't metal, or a toxic herb. It was still alive. Fact 12. Lancing the buboes of the plague. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death swept across Europe, leaving behind a symptom that terrified the masses massive. Swollen lymph nodes, known as buboes, appearing on the necks, armpits, and groins of the infected. They were engorged, turned a dark purplish black, and ached so intensely that many could barely move. Faced with these grotesque swellings, many healers came to a simple conclusion: whatever is trapped inside must be released outward. A blade was brought to the swelling. Following the incision, pus and thick fluid immediately spilled out. The healers then stuffed the wound with a mixture of honey, pine resin, crushed garlic, and sometimes even animal feces, believing these would draw out the remaining toxic miasma from the body. But reality went in the exact opposite direction. The unsterilized open incisions shattered the body's final line of defense, creating a direct pathway for the Yersinia pestis bacteria to flood straight into the bloodstream. Many patients didn't die from the initial bubo, but from the massive infection that spread far faster following the treatment. During the same era, the Arab scholar Ibn Khatama began documenting the hypothesis that the plague might be connected to invisible, microscopic organisms invading the human body. But that idea received almost no attention. Ibn Khatama wrote that in 1349, and while no one was listening to him, in other parts of Europe, people had begun to see an entirely different value in the corpses left behind by the pandemic. Fact 13. Human fat for joint pain pharmaceuticals from the execution ground. Following the plagues and public executions in 16th century Europe, a portion of the dead bodies was not immediately buried. They entered the pharmaceutical market. On the shelves of many pharmacies of the time sat small glass jars containing pale yellow fat, named Oxungia hominis. It was sold as a remedy for joint pain, gout, and slow-healing wounds. Its source was human fat. After every execution, the executioner kept the adipose tissue from the corpse, melted it down, and sold it to pharmacies. In cities like Munich, some people even opened their own stalls to sell this pharmaceutical. Patients paid money to take the fat of a complete stranger and rub it onto their own bodies. Some didn't even know that the medicine melting on their skin had belonged to a condemned prisoner beheaded just days prior. What is remarkable is that later studies revealed human adipose tissue is genuinely involved in the process of vascular regeneration and repairing damaged tissue. Up until the early 20th century, some human tissue extracts still appeared in European wound treatments. The people of that era had stumbled upon a very real biological mechanism. They just approached it by making the boundary between medicine and the execution ground virtually disappear. Executioners in Munich profited from both ends executing humans, and then continuing to sell fragments of their bodies back to society. But in this entire list, there remains a method that required no medicine, No metal, not even any pharmacological properties, and its effectiveness continues to spark debate in modern psychology to this day. Fact 14. Surgery to extract the stone of madness. In the late Middle Ages, many Europeans believed that paranoia, uncontrollable behavior, or madness originated from a physical object existing inside the skull, the stone of madness. And if that thing was inside the patient's head, the obvious solution was to take it out. Some wandering healers turned this procedure into a public spectacle in the middle of town squares. The patient sat before the crowd, while the healer pretended to perform a minor intervention on the scalp, and then used metal forceps to pull out a blood-stained stone they had palmed beforehand. The crowd believed the disease had been removed, and sometimes the patient believed it too. There were cases where the patient genuinely stabilized after that theatrical performance, not because a stone was removed from their brain, but because their entire surrounding environment began treating them like a cured person. The fearful stares vanished. The stigma plummeted. Families and communities changed how they reacted to the individual. And that social pressure sometimes generated very real psychological shifts. There was no stone of madness ever existing in the brain. But the belief that it had been removed was sometimes enough to completely transform a human being. The most terrifying aspect of medieval medicine doesn't lie in the bone saws or the mercury steam boxes. It lies in the fact that the vast majority of the people performing them truly believed they were saving lives. They could not see bacteria. They did not understand the nervous system. They had no idea what was actually happening inside the human body. Every single method on this list was built from the absolute best knowledge that era could reach. And perhaps that is what makes medical history so incredibly frightening. No one in the Middle Ages thought they were torturing people. They were merely following what their era called proper science, just as we are doing today. No one knows if, a few centuries from now, the humans of the future will look back at our current medical methods with profound respect, or with the exact same sense of disbelief we now use to look back at the past.